wish it.
You said she's actually going to be speaking. Well, it's certainly wonderful to be back here. I have a couple of good friends who just...
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to D.G. Wills Books in La Jolla, California. Tonight we're honored to have Iris Chang, who has made her way across the country discussing her new book, The Chinese in America, A Narrative History. Let me say something briefly about Iris. Iris is the author of the international bestseller, The Rape of Nanking. After graduating with a degree in journalism from the University of Illinois, she worked briefly as a reporter in Chicago before winning a graduate fellowship to the Writing Seminars program at Johns Hopkins University. Her first book, Thread of the Silkworm, told the story of, and I wanted to ask you how to pronounce, Xian Hushen, the father of the People's Republic of China's missile program. Iris is the recipient of numerous honors, including the John T. and Catherine D. MacArthur Foundation's Program on Peace and International Cooperation Award, the Woman of the Year Award from the Organization of Chinese Americans, and an honorary doctorate from the College of Worcester. Instead of Worcester, it's Worcester, in Ohio, I think. Her work has appeared in many publications, such as Newsweek, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. Her new book, The Chinese in America, A Narrative History, is an epic story that spans 150 years and chronicles the many accomplishments in America of Chinese immigrants and their descendants. For example, building the Transcontinental Railroad, working on southern plantations after the Civil War, fighting racist and exclusionary laws, contributing to major scientific and technological advances, expanding the literary canon, and influencing the way we think about racial and ethnic groups. Interweaving political, social, economic, and cultural history in an engrossing and passionately told account, Iris Chang offers a fresh view, not only of what it means to be Chinese American, but what it is to be American. Ladies and gentlemen, Iris Chang.
Thank you so much. And before I begin, I'd like to give a special thanks to Dennis, who so generously hosted a book signing of mine years ago. It was to promote The Rape of Nanking, and I had just such wonderful, fond memories of this store. If I lived in La Jolla, I would be here all the time. I was just in the bathroom. It was hard for me to even leave the bathroom because of the selection of all the intellectual essays there. This is a wonderful place. And I want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight to support this book. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read from chapter 20, the final chapter of my book. It's entitled An Uncertain Future, because I think the history of the Chinese in this country has been one of great cycles of acceptance and abuse, and wild swings between xenophobia and also acceptance. And I think it's a pattern that has been repeated over time, not only for the Chinese but other ethnic groups as well. What I'd like to do is first read from that chapter, and then I encourage all of you to ask questions. I think the audience participation is often one of the most exciting parts of these lectures, and then we'll have the book signing itself. And so this chapter starts with a quote from Governor Gary Locke of Washington State, and he's the first Chinese-American governor in the United States, and this is what he had to say. My grandfather came to this country from China nearly a century ago and worked as a servant. Now I serve as governor just 1 mile from where my grandfather worked. It took our family 100 years to travel that mile. It was a voyage we could only make in America. My book chronicles only the past and present journey of the Chinese in America, not where their story will go from here. Each new generation must rediscover history in the light of new events, and so it must be left to future scholars to continue the narrative. Instead, I can only close this book with a fervent hope that readers will recognize the story of my people, the Chinese in the United States, not as a foreign story, but a quintessentially American one. From the very moment the Chinese set foot on American soil, their dreams have been American dreams. They scrambled for gold in the dirt of California. They aspired to own their own land and businesses, and fought to have their children educated in American schools alongside other American children. Like most immigrant groups, they came here fleeing war and famine, persecution and poverty. And like the descendants of other immigrant groups, their children have come to call the United States home. The America of today would not be the same America without the achievements of its ethnic Chinese. Generation after generation, they worked to build the American nation into its present level of greatness. Some fought in the Civil War and built the railroad that welded the country together. Their early struggles for justice created new foundations of law later used by the Civil Rights Movement. They built America's earliest rockets and helped win the Cold War. In Silicon Valley and elsewhere, their contributions helped establish and maintain U.S. supremacy in the information age. Today, they are dispersed in every profession imaginable, as inventors, teachers, authors, doctors, engineers, lawyers, CEOs, social workers, accountants, architects, police chiefs, firefighters, actors, and astronauts. But sadly, despite this long legacy of contribution, many Chinese Americans continue to be regarded as foreigners. Go back to where you came from is a taunt that most new immigrants have faced at some point. As one put it, Asian Americans feel like we're a guest in someone else's house, that we can never really relax and put our feet up on the table. Accents and cultural traditions may disappear, but skin tone and the shape of one's eyes do not. These features have eased the way for some to regard the ethnic Chinese people as exotic and different, certainly not real Americans. And thus the Americanization of Chinese Americans have been overshadowed by the convenient but dishonest stereotypes in the mass market, which portray them as innately and irreversibly different from their fellow Americans. And what, in human terms, is the impact of such divisiveness? It's a native-born Californian, a West Covina city council member, being told over the phone, "Funny, you don't sound like a Wong. You sound so American." It's the virtual absence of Chinese-American doctors on medical TV dramas, when in actuality 1 in 6 medical doctors in the United States is Asian American. It's a famous Chinese-American movie star with good reviews and serious work reporting that she and her colleagues are always asked by studios to, quote, don our accents and use our high kicks a la Jackie Chan or Bond girl. It's the decision of the Mattel toy company not to release an Asian Barbie doll in their year 2000 fantasy collection of future female American presidents, even though white, black, and Hispanic dolls are included. As Berkeley professor Elaine Kim notes, people like Asian American dolls in costumes, not as president. This tells you how we are thought of. In June 1999, Ted Lieu, a United States Air Force captain who grew up in Ohio and attended college in California, wrote the following for the Washington Post, and I'm going to quote from him directly. "Are you in the Chinese Air Force?" the elegantly dressed lady sitting next to me asked. For a minute I was left speechless. We were at an awards dinner, and I was proudly wearing my blue United States Air Force uniform, complete with captain's bars, military insignia, and medals. Her question jarred me and made me realize that even Air Force blue was not enough to reverse her initial presumption that people with yellow skin and Asian features are somehow not American. I wish this was just an isolated incident. Unfortunately, too many people today still view Asian Americans as foreigners in America. As an officer in the United States Air Force, one day I may be called to give my life to my country. It would be a shame if some people still question what I mean when I say my country. Scratch the surface of every American celebrity of Chinese heritage, and you will find that no matter how stellar their achievements, no matter how great their contribution to U.S. society, virtually all of them have had their identities questioned at some point or another. Connie Chung, the second woman in American history to co-anchor a network nightly news broadcast, survived an unwelcoming newsroom atmosphere. Being one of the few women was bad enough, but as she adds, in those early days at CBS, 1971 to 1976, people were saying yellow journalism, little remarks that were clearly racist. But as late as 1990, Cliff Kincaid, a radio host in Washington, D.C., would call her Connie Chink. Maya Lin, now the most famous female architect in the United States, was viciously attacked when, as a Yale undergraduate in 1980, she won a nationwide contest to design the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Some veterans asked, "How can you let a gook design this? How did it happen that an Asian American woman was permitted to make a memorial for American men who died fighting in Asia?" Now, Lynn later noted her loyalty and patriotism to the United States, and she wrote in Art in America, 1991, "If you ask, I would identify myself as Chinese American. If I had to choose one thing over another, I would choose American. I was not born in China. I was not raised there, and the China my parents knew no longer exists. I don't have an allegiance to any country but this one. It is my home." And then there was Amy Tan. After her novel, The Joy Luck Club, became a literary blockbuster, she had to struggle to get it produced in Hollywood. Before the movie was released, one film executive complained to Chris Lee, the Chinese-American president of Columbia TriStar, that there were no Americans in the Joy Luck Club. Lee retorted, "There are Americans in it. They just don't look like you." At the 1998 Olympics, when U.S. figure skater Michelle Kwan finished second after her teammate Tara Lipinski, the headlines on MSNBC read, "American beats Kwan." Many Chinese Americans were distressed to learn that the media automatically considered Kwan a foreigner when in fact she had been born, reared, and trained in the United States. 4 years later, the error was repeated after Kwan lost the gold medal to Sarah Hughes. In a secondary headline, the Seattle Times announced, "American outshines Kwan Sliskaya in skating surprise." In 1998, when Matt Fong, a California state treasurer, ran for the U.S. Senate, reporters asked him which country he would support if the U.S. and China went to war. Fong was a fourth-generation American and the son of March Fong-yu, the first Asian-American woman to serve as a California Secretary of State. He lost the race and later told Time magazine, "There is a subtle stereotyping and racism just below the surface." In May 2001, David Wu, the first Chinese American ever elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, was stopped when he tried to enter the Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. As Wu later said, "Most strikingly, I was asked a couple of times whether I am a U.S. citizen or not. This was both after I showed my congressional ID and after Ted Lieu, Wu's congressional aide, showed him his staff ID." In the year 2001, Elaine Chao, a Harvard Business School graduate who had served as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission and Assistant Secretary of Transportation, made history as the first Chinese American to accept a cabinet position when President George W. Bush named her Secretary of Labor. When her critics attacked her business ties with China, her husband, Senator Mitch McConnell, saw subtle racism, yellow fever, and xenophobic attitudes in the media. Time and again, the question is posed within the Chinese American community. How many hoops do we have to jump through in order to be considered real Americans? These episodes of racism do not occur by accident in a vacuum, nor do they arise solely on the basis of physical differences. Throughout American history, and indeed the history of most societies, the ruling class has carefully exploited differences in race and ethnicity as a mechanism of control, as a convenient smokescreen in order to make their own control more palatable. Racism has often divided and diminished American labor by thwarting the union of white and colored workers that would help them win on issues that affect them all, and has enabled the government to expand its scope of authority during emergencies, such as economic depression or war. At such times, entire ethnic groups can be vilified and sacrificed as scapegoats to rally other people behind a leader's solution. Such was the fate of the Chinese in America on the eve of the exclusion era. And as this book neared completion, anti-Chinese sentiment rose again in a resurgence of hatred reminiscent of the pre-exclusion days. This time it derived its energy from popular fear of sweeping international forces, the globalization of the economy, and the rise in power and prestige of the People's Republic of China. At the dawn of the third millennium, China had emerged both economically and militarily as a global superpower. Chinese industrial and technological development had rushed forward at such breathtaking speed that some economic experts anointed the 21st century as the Chinese century. In September 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, signifying its full legitimacy in the international marketplace and resuscitating fears that American jobs would be lost to Chinese hordes willing to work for very little. At the same time, the decline of the former Soviet Empire stoked American fears about China's armed forces, which command the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, as well as the greatest military in Asia. Washington has wavered between depicting China as our newest trading partner and market, and also, with the demise of the Soviet bloc, as our successor enemy in the post-Cold War era. A telling incident occurred in April 2001, when a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea, apparently flying too close to an American Navy spy plane on a routine U.S. surveillance mission, caused the American pilot to take sudden evasive action, resulting in a mid-air collision. The Chinese pilot was killed, and the Chinese government detained the 24 American crew members of the spy plane after they made an emergency landing on China's Hainan Island. After 11 days of tense negotiations and a carefully worded apology from the United States, the PRC released the crew. But by that time, the Chinese-American community had suffered a furious backlash from their fellow Americans. Patrick Oliphant, a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist, published a shocking caricature of a Chinese man complete with buck teeth and thick glasses serving cat gizzards. The National Review complained that the Chinese, quote, put MSG in everything, and claimed, "If my dog were a member of the American crew, Jiang Zemin would have eaten him by now." During the spy plane crisis, recalls Teresa Ma, a Chinese-American chemist in Lincoln, Nebraska, a neighbor approached her and asked, "Why don't you go to China to bring our men home?" This neighbor could not figure out the difference between Chinese Americans and Chinese foreign nationals, despite the fact that many Chinese Americans were U.S. citizens whose families had lived here for generations. Some members of the media even recommended the mass dismissal or expulsion or even the imprisonment of the entire Chinese American community. In Springfield, Illinois, 2 radio DJs urged the boycott of all Chinese American restaurants, suggested that all Chinese Americans be shipped out of the country, and telephoned people with Chinese last names to harass them on the air. A Fox News host called for Chinese employees to be fired from the national laboratories. A national talk show host demanded that Chinese Americans be interned by the federal government, as the Japanese Americans were during World War II. Surveys also demonstrated the depth of anti-Chinese sentiment. A 2001 Gallup poll found that more than 80% of Americans viewed the PRC as dangerous. In another poll, a national telephone survey commissioned by the Committee of 100 and the Anti-Defamation League of 1,216 randomly selected adult Americans, close to half thought that Chinese Americans, quote, passing secrets to the Chinese government is a problem. Almost a third believed that Chinese Americans were more loyal to the PRC than to the U.S. And in the political arena, Chinese and other Asian Americans stood out as the most unpopular candidates of all. Among those surveyed, more people felt reluctant to vote for an Asian American president than for a woman, an African American, or a Jewish American. And for the Chinese American community, these polls confirmed many of their worst fears, that their acceptance was linked to the ever-shifting relations between the United States and China, rather than to their own particular behavior. And it was sobering to consider that, more than a century after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were still perceived by many to be strangers in their own country. There's more to this chapter, but I do want to point out that some of the more recent developments in our country actually could not make it in this book because of the publication date. And some of the persecution that the Middle Eastern immigrant community and other groups have experienced since the terrorist attacks of 9/11 are closely closely mirror the Chinese-American experience during the exclusion era and also during the McCarthy era. And I point this out only because I feel that this book should be viewed not just as like some kind of foreign story or as an ethnic story, but rather as an American story. It's just one facet of the American immigrant experience, and it's a story that carries many cautionary lessons for us all. And I think as long as any group can be scapegoated or the victim of racial profiling, none of us are safe, because the laws that are passed that hurt one particular group will eventually affect us all. And I guess if there's just one message that I want all of you to take home with you, that this book describes the struggle of one immigrant group for the American dream and for democracy, and it just shows that for the Chinese and for many other immigrant groups, democracy was never a guarantee in this country, but rather a very delicate and fragile experiment. Thank you so much for your time. So the hardest thing was to decide really not so much what to put in, but what to leave out, because it's a very broad subject. 150 years of Chinese American history compressed in one volume.